Welcome to Zain Live, where everything is discussed and nothing is censored. Today, our topic is philosophy dead? Is philosophy still relevant in the scientific world? Today, our first guest joining us from Canada, a Canadian journalist and also a social commentator, Matthew Ehret. Joining us from Pakistan is Abdul Manan. He is a philosopher and he also runs a philosophical think tank by the name of Saval Sangat. Welcome to our show, Matthew. This is Zain Khan. It's a pleasure having you on Zain Khan Live.
It's always a pleasure to be here, Zain.
Welcome to our show, Abdul Manan. It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure is all mine, sir. Thank you.
Now, you are a philosopher. You've written on the subject. You teach philosophy in different private colleges. Today's topic is on, is philosophy even relevant? I want to first ask the question to Matthew Abdul Manan. Matthew, I was recently reading a book. It's probably in my library somewhere. By the author Sam Harris in his book, Moral Landscape. He argues that morality and ethics are based on science. Is that even possible?
Well, in the course of his book and his many lectures and theses, Sam produces what I find to be a very discombobulated set of presumptions and assumptions that he generalizes quite heavily onto all of science, philosophy, and religion. In the course of that book, it's difficult to know where to even begin to address that, but I don't think it's necessarily possible in the way that he thinks of science to have a science of morality that won't turn fascist ultimately. I think that one of the key Achilles heels or problem assumptions that he has and that he imposes onto his readers is that in creating a science of morality, he says that there's going to be three phases to this operation, because it's going to also involve a purge of all of the fallacious ways of thinking that contaminate human society for thousands of years or longer. And so on the one hand, the scientists have to first, in phase one, explain what we do and why we do it. And number two, the second phase, we have to determine what patterns should be promoted and imbued into society to modify our behavior and ways of thinking to the right way. And number three, we have to persuade then humanity to change to that idealized state of what should be. And I think that this three-phase operation defies his core assumption, which is that he follows Hume by saying that we cannot ever get an ought from an is. That is to say, he's of the view that you cannot get an ideal state from a material or practical state, or a spiritual state from a material state. Already what he does in his three-phase operation is to propose an idealized world of perfectly moral society according to his standards of a scientific, what I think is a scientific dictatorship or priesthood, that defies free will, which he rejects completely. And he says, okay, even though that this doesn't exist and we don't have any evidence that this idealized state that we want to bring into being should exist, we're going to do it anyway. That defies his own assumptions. So I think that there's a lot of self-contradictions, and that's just one of many, many, many contradictions that I think can be unpacked.
Mr. Abdul Manan, this is your subject, philosophy, which Sam Harris outrightly denies has anything to do with determining ethics. In my opinion, I think that philosophy, it basically limits science. It gives it its four corners. It explains in science of philosophy what science can and cannot do, the methodology. What's your opinion behind it? Do you think that only science has the capacity to determine morality? Or do you think that philosophy will guide science into determining morality? How do you look at it?
Actually, the thing is, the question is a bit wider than that. The question of morality is a bit different kind of a thing. I think it has a different kind of a side, because it has some political implications as well, some sociological implications, culture, and all those things. So when we talk about science determining the issue of moralities, or the rivalry of science, for that matter, between the rivalry of science, the rivalry between science and philosophy in determining the moral status of certain kind of political values. These are actually two different phenomena. The thing is that as far as the topic, the first question is concerned, that is philosophy relevant or is philosophy dead? Ironically, the question itself is a kind of a philosophical question, and you can't, ignore some kind of philosophy without doing some kind of philosophical thinking. You can't deal with this kind of a question. You presume, actually, in fact, you presume some kind of philosophical notions to deal with this issue, even if you advocate the death of philosophy in some sense. You have to do some kind of philosophy. I mean, right from the times of Greeks, you see this popular kind of defense has always been there for philosophy, which might be popular, but it's not all that false. Actually, it is still relevant. That and the kind of paradox that Matthew has talked about, the paradoxical nature or the self-refuting nature of the Sam Harris kind of thinking, he has already touched upon it, and that's the kind of paradox that you have to face in these issues. As far as your question is concerned, now I will come back to that. That philosophy, whether the philosophy has philosophy actually limits the role of science in some way, or tries to sort of push it to the wall in some areas.
No,
This is not the case.
I
Actually,
think it guides science.
it actually evaluates more than determining anything. Philosophy actually evaluates the certain problems of science or the scientific thinking, scientific methodologies, because this is the whole nature of philosophy. Actually, philosophy is not structured in a way uh, which can that it can never kind of be be sort of judged in a black and white kind of a way. Any philosophical judgment cannot be judged in a black and white kind of way. You can't say that philosophy, when philosophy actually deals with certain kind of scientific, theories, or with the scientific methodologies, it doesn't give any kind of judgment in a way, that it just actually evaluates the role of science. It evaluates the method, the sort of methodology of science, and the philosophical implications of those scientific theories. For example, if you see that historically as well, in the early 20th century, when science was supposedly in a deep, kind of quagmire, and it was facing a kind of a crisis from the science itself, and all the classical physics, and it was being refuted, and there were many trends which were sort of hijacking the science, many political trends and many political ideologies which were hijacking science, and they all used to claim to be scientific in some sense. So it was the philosophy that actually saved science in that sense. Science was actually about to die at that time, and scientific methodology was uh, extremely vague. Scientific methodology was in an extreme kind of crisis, when philosophy actually moved forward and saved it, and saved the status of science in that sense. So, because every political ideology was claiming to be scientific.
How exactly did it save it? Which point in history?
It saved actually the philosophy of science. Actually, the philosophy of science as a whole actually saved it from that crisis. Philosophy of science actually deals science in two ways. One is the philosophical implications of science, and the other is the philosophical methodologies. Even if you see that some kind of philosophical trends within the philosophy of science that advocates that only in the real development of science can we determine the values and the methodologies for science. The role of philosophy in that context is just to evaluate things, just to evaluate and to clarify the language involved in that kind of philosophy, that kind of scientific thinking, because sometimes most of the time, in fact, it's the categories of thought that we think in, and and the kind of linguistic constructs that we use as the basis to construct a certain kind of scientific paradigm, so that sort of create all kind of ambiguities and all kind of confusions. So is the philosophy that actually evaluates it, not only evaluates it, but also gives a certain kind of a working model, develops a working model for science as well. So actually the thing is that this kind of scientism, which is prevalent in the Western philosophical thinking these days, it is deeply connected to the new atheism. And most of the categories of new atheism and the scientism are so much muddled up in a way that it's very difficult to, it's not easy actually, it's not easy to kind of differentiate all those categories and to deal with them in a kind of more sophisticated way, because they all are kind of
we'll get to new atheism and scientism in just a moment. I want to get to Matthew. Abdul Manan just said that science that philosophy evaluates and determines science, right? Evaluates science. That's what he termed it as. How do you look at this point of Mr. Manan? And also, I want to ask you, some of our listeners could easily say that Mr. Abdul Manan could be slightly biased because philosophy is his subject. So I want to ask you this question, since you're unbiased and there are a lot of other more subjects that you study and you are part of. Do you think philosophy is irrelevant in this day and age? How do you look at this? Is philosophy useless now?
Well, I think that the terms we use sometimes are underdefined. So we often, I find myself in many instances in life having conversations with people, and you talk for a long time, and then you realize, oh, you're actually using different definitions of core terms that you've been talking about this whole time, and you're in two different universes, and you didn't realize it this whole time until some paradox strikes or something, And I think the idea of philosophy, for sure, this is primary in my mind. As far as evaluating, yes, the results and direction of science. But the very word philosophy itself, we have to remind ourselves, comes from the love of wisdom, philosophia, and that's in opposition to the view of the sophists, who were just people who promulgated the assumption that they knew wisdom in ancient Greek and would charge money for people who wanted to learn the arts of persuasion and rhetoric. Masquerading as wisdom, but not really the real thing, because there was no love of it. Whereas Socrates and his followers made a very different point, that no, to love wisdom means that you're willing to do and to go beyond the limits of the simple sophists, and evaluate your own thinking, such that even if you do achieve fame, popularity, in your field of thought, whether it's in science or anything, and you discover that there's something wrong in your thinking, but nobody else knows, you yourself are willing to reevaluate and tear down your own model, the construct that made you famous, because you love truth more than that. And so, yes, I think that most people would fall into the category, most unfortunately, of going along with whatever standards are prevalent and will be rewarded for certain ways of thinking in their careers or other things. A good case in point is Max Planck. And Planck is somebody who was told by his teachers in science, in physics in the 19th century, that you better just pursue your career as a pianist, because there's everything in physics has already been discovered. All that's left is just to sort of iron out some of the details. And Max Planck was a man of he loved creativity. He was a man of deep faith, and he found this morally offensive, this idea that there could be a closed system of rules that defines and limits our science, which is why he said, no, that was a challenge to me. And he chose to go into science. That only made him pursue it even more. And the results of his passion was the discovery that nobody else was able to make of the quantum of action inside of the and he opened up the door to quantum physics with the help of his other musician, philosopher friend, Albert Einstein. which we know had measurable impacts upon the ability for humanity to tap into the energy of the atom, to sustain greater quality of people, greater quality of life, and have more people with greater forces of energy at our disposal by discovering those invisible laws of nature. But you have to look at the philosophy of both men was a devout faith in the discoverability of the universe, and also in the worthwhile pursuit of the unknown. Because as Sam Harris says that there is no such thing as free will. What's his proof? He says, because if you could think about something, if you could know what you were going to think about and choose what you were going to think about, he says you would already know that thought. And so it's impossible, it's paradoxical and thus impossible that you would have any ability to know what you were going to think, to choose a course of action. He also says that we're also determined by our behavior and by our genetic, forces. And that's all we have. But all discoveries, real discoveries in science, demonstrate that there's something more, that we don't just have deductive and inductive reasoning that is useful as tools in science, but at every phase, whether it was at Max Planck's period in the 1880s, 1890s, or whether it was Kepler's point in the 1590s, the tools of deductive and inductive reasoning and the mathematical symbolic language that we have to work with when we're pursuing and going out into the ocean of the universe mentally to discover a new undiscovered law, the pre-existing language doesn't have the answer to the problem that we're seeking. So you could either be somebody who just wants to model, to impose your system of limited modeling onto the whole universe and say the whole universe behaves according to what we already know, or you could be somebody who is creative and recognizes the limits of their mathematical language and instead does like what Kepler does and looks for a paradox. Look to see, where does your language break down when confronted with the empirical data of the universe? In Kepler's case, it was the investigation of the retrograde motion of Mars. In the Planck case, it was looking at black body radiation, but they're all looking at the paradoxes. Where does it break down? And then they are able to cultivate through rigor the choice to pursue a discovery which results in a eureka that then transmits back into the rest of humanity. So I think that philosophy is very important, but it has to be a true love and not a fake love of real wisdom, and that will have huge impact. And also, I would just add, that's why nihilists and existentialists are not known for coming up with a lot of creative scientific discoveries. They come up with a lot of social theories that they try to then impose onto people cynically, but they actually don't come up with any real big discoveries in science.
But philosophy as a subject, I just want a one-liner. Do you think it's irrelevant?
No.
Getting to you, Mr. Abdul Manan, this is your subject. Since you teach it, I want a quick answer from you. Are you a determinist or not? And why not?
Well, I'm not. Actually, determinism itself is a kind of a self-refuting kind of a stance. So obviously, we're not going into details on this issue, but I'm not determinist. And Sam Harris' position is actually, because of its being deterministic, and when you refute the role of free will, you actually deny the whole science as well. Actually, these are the paradoxes, which are ultimate kind of paradoxes, which are ignored by many otherwise smart minds in the modern society, and they don't understand the ultimate paradoxes involved in this kind of thinking. For example, you take the case of Daniel Dennett, as Matthew talked about. Matthew mentioned Sam Harris. Take the case of Daniel Dennett. He's a trained philosopher. He totally denies the role of consciousness as well. For him, consciousness is just an illusion. And if consciousness is an illusion, then who the hell is actually talking about this illusion of consciousness? So this is a very simple question, and the old one, but it's still relevant. And the other thing is, actually, when we talk about the death of philosophy, the other thing that I want to mention, if you have the time, that when we talk about the death of philosophy, this statement itself is a bit vague, actually, and it is used by different kind of people in a different sense. So we have to differentiate the kind of context people put forward this case. Some people talk about it as a kind of social phenomena, that philosophy is dead these days. In education, in politics, they're not all joyful about it. They're not excited about the fact that philosophy is dead. They, in fact, many philosophers actually say that philosophy is dead these days, but they don't obviously mean in the sense the way new atheists use it, or the advocates of scientism use it. The thing is that, or for that matter, the Stephen Hawking actually said it. Actually, we all talk about the philosophy is dead these days, because people pay very less importance to the love of wisdom. People pay very less attention to the fact that how important philosophical thinking is in developing the kind of theorization in social sciences, or determining the kind of point of contact between science, theology, and other social sciences. So that's why, and the other thing is compartmentalization of knowledge as well, because these days we tend to actually produce the specialists in different fields. So interdisciplinary kind of communication, or the interdisciplinary kind of knowledge is actually dying these days. So that is another fact. This is the political context, or the social, the context of this statement that philosophy is dead. The other is used by those new atheists, or the advocates of scientism. That I think is a bit childish. Actually, they don't. I don't think any one of them has ever read any kind of technical paper of philosophy. I very much doubt it, because whatever the way they talk about it, the way they talk about philosophical issues itself shows that they have read very little philosophy. Even the great Stephen Hawking, there's no doubt that he was a great scientist. We all know that. But using his authority to kind of, advocating to sort of using it as an evidence against the importance of philosophy is totally childish, because using it's a kind of a miserable misuse of authority. It's just like a great sportsman promoting the benefits of a fizz drink in a commercial ad. So this is totally ridiculous in a way. So, and as theoretical physicist Martin Rees himself put it, that Stephen Hawking has read very little philosophy and even less theology, and so we shouldn't give much weight to his ideas on these issues. So that's another thing that we tend to, and all this actually kind of phenomena that talks about the death of philosophy in a very naive kind of a way. They are actually living intellectually. They are living in the 18th and 19th century. They know very little about the developments of in the field of philosophy actually and social sciences in the 20th century. And another issue is that when they talk about the death of philosophy, even they don't know that even many philosophers many philosophers actually talk about the death of philosophy in a certain context, because for the logical positivists, which itself is a kind of a greatest philosophical movement of the 20th century, they talk about the death of the traditional philosophy actually. They start their case from the rejection of the traditional philosophy. For example, Heidegger's Being and Time was presented as an example of philosophical nonsense by the logical positivists. And these people who talk about the clash between science and philosophy, actually, they actually take philosophy most of the time. By philosophy, they mean postmodernism or the postmodernist thinkers, or especially after the Sokal affair. Alan Sokal was a scientist, and he sort of fooled the postmodern journal in publishing some kind of gibberish just in order to expose the kind of fashionable nonsense of the postmodernism. But they don't know that not all continental philosophers or the European philosophers are postmodernist, and there is a split in the philosophical community as well, and split between the analytic philosophy and the continental philosophy. So you can't give a kind of a sweeping kind of a state judgment, or sweeping kind of and you can't generalize kind of a judgment on this issue. And when we talk about philosophy, the relationship between philosophy and science, you have to stick to the mainly stick to the philosophy of science. Actually, philosophy, uh, when we talk about science and philosophy, science as a whole and philosophy as a whole, these are not you can't kind of determine any kind of relationship between science as a whole and the philosophy as a whole. You have to take you have to differentiate between the certain aspects which are relevant for the philosophies to deal with, and you have to take certain kind of the content of science that cannot be in which philosophy has nothing to do with, and philosophy doesn't have any role to play. So these are the points I think which should be mentioned in a bit more detail on this issue.
Matthew, Mr. Manan just summarized his points. I have a question in mind, and I want to ask you in lay terms. A scientist comes up to you and says that cloning has become extremely easy. Let's start cloning. Now, who is going to determine if cloning is ethical or not? Then we have the problem of organ transplants. So when we look at bioethics and we look at other philosophical branches, don't you think that philosophy is there to tell us about aesthetics, about ethical issues, and so on and so forth? How can science claim that it has now taken the place of all other subjects and philosophy is dead? I mean, how do you comment on that? Doesn't philosophy comment on the ethical avenues of science?
Well, I think that in reading the original writings of a lot of great scientists, and I'm going to get directly to your question on bioethics, but one is often struck by the profound faith and spirituality of many of the greatest minds in science. And I mean, I already mentioned Max Planck, Kepler, Einstein. You can go back to the days of Plato, Archytas, of Samos. You could look at the ancients as well as many of the moderns, and certainly, even in the case of a lot of the NASA astronauts, there wasn't an idea of their, metaphysics and religion and faith on the one side, and then science and mechanics and technical matters on the other side. There wasn't this compartmentalization for much of the human experience, but they were seen as two sides of the same coin, because there was a general cultural orientation toward that valued the sacredness of life and that valued a certain idea of the soul that was not always like, it was never hegemonic as like far as everybody believing the same thing, but there was a powerful orientation in that direction that had a metaphysical idea of sacredness that was tied to driving your science policy. And it's all about policy because you can't detach science from statecraft. So the decision to go to tie our political economy towards space exploration, towards investigations into the atom, the geometry of the atom for the benefit of humankind was always there. I think that in recent decades, we have increasingly fallen into a very nihilistic culture. And, we've talked about the new atheism. We've talked a little bit about, Abdul has talked about postmodernism and its effects on broader philosophy as well as in science practice. I think that when you detach morality and metaphysics from science, then everything becomes increasingly used towards destructive ends, whether the people practicing it, as far as the scientific dictatorship is concerned, or the social psychologists at the top of the pyramidal hierarchy or whatever, are concerned. Maybe they don't think that. Maybe they think that they're putting everything into practice for the common good, whatever that means to them. But I think that you'll find an abuse and misuse if the idea of life as sacred is eliminated. So I think that in that sense, if you look at, am I against, for example, GMOs? Not intrinsically, not in principle. I think that if you have a society that values life, then you could enrich your vitamins in your tomatoes and your food to be extremely vitamin rich and good for you. If you live in a monoculture society that just values shareholder profit for too long, then increasingly they will value, putting GMOs into practice that perhaps keep the tomatoes from rotting for months on end and looking really good, but being completely devoid of any nutrition. And I think the same thing could apply in bioethics for stem cell research, cloning, other things. I don't think cloning is necessarily something we'd want to do, but I don't think that any of these practices are by themselves imbued with morality or immorality. It's really the question of, is your system in your society a moral one, or is it not? And if it isn't, if the science becomes defined as, around this objective manipulation of machines that are called humans, but they're being thought of and defined as really just machines, then it will be used increasingly destructively, and you will.
And that is a philosophical domain, right? That's a philosophical question.
Yes. Sorry, can you not hear me?
Yeah, I was saying that is also a philosophical question, right?
Oh, yeah, very much so. And I mean, a lot of these scientists who are trying to say that they don't believe in philosophy, or that philosophy is dead, they are themselves not able to follow or adhere to their own principles because they have philosophical prejudices implicitly involved in their, whether it's Stephen Hawking, whether it's Dawkins, whether it's Harris. There is implicit broad philosophical views of the nature of the universe, God, space, time, human nature. It's all there. Even though they try to deny it, they can't avoid it. And they just lie to themselves and to others to say, no, we're just objective practitioners of pure science. And they're saying, the science is going to replace human mentation and human values, because the science is its own thing. And they become worshipers of a religion of science. And it's a dishonest religion.
I want to get to Abdul. Abdul Manan, my criticism on philosophy, since I'm a student of philosophy, I want to criticize philosophy in the same domain as some philosophers criticize philosophy, not as the new atheists criticize philosophy. In my opinion, I think in the last 50 to 100 years, philosophy has not been able to innovate as much as it did in the past 1,000 years. What is the reason behind that? And do you agree with what I say? And how do you think we could assist it in the innovation? How philosophers can advance human wisdom?
I will answer this question in a more kind of a philosophical fashion. That it is both true and false at the same time, actually. And as far as basically in philosophy, when we talk about the progress or the contribution of these things, these are basically in social context or in other domains of knowledge, they are used in a different way. People tend to see things developing in a linear kind of a fashion. But in philosophy, no development is kind of linear in that sense. Philosophy can take some time U-turn as well. And there are certain trends. For example, in last 100 years, more than 100 years, there have been certain trends which have sort of actually contributed a lot to the development of science, as I've already mentioned, and to the social sciences as well. But philosophy, actually, no philosophical tradition actually approach these things with the kind of with the intention of contributing anything or developing anything, or by using oversimplified kind of political notions like progress and all these things. For philosophy, the thing is basically is to evaluate those domains of knowledge. That's the main function of philosophy. Well, I would on the function of philosophy, I take a quotation from Deleuze as a gospel truth. Deleuze says that the main function of philosophy is to impede stupidity. So wherever you find stupidity, you just kind of reject it, or you deal with it in a more kind of brutal way, intellectually brutal way. So that's the main task of philosophy, actually, to impede any kind of stupidity. But the thing is that most of the time philosophy is basically blamed for being more Eurocentric and more kind of sexist, Eurocentric, and kind of So these are the things that philosophy actually philosophy is usually blamed for. So which is not actually true. Philosophy actually is not something which can compromise the value of a certain intellectual enterprise on the basis of the politically desirable or politically correct or incorrect notions. Because these days, sometimes politically correct notions, correctness is going a bit too far actually. And whatever is considered in the domain of knowledge, whatever is considered politically incorrect, it is rejected and it is condemned like anything. And so these are the things. In fact, most of the time, scientism, the scientific naturalism is
And
also attacked.
don't you think that that political correctness actually tries to stop knowledge, tries to curtail free thinking and the advancement of thought?
Of course, and very true. Political correctness is actually the biggest hurdle in the development of knowledge these days. And it forces you to compromise a certain stance all the time. If it is considered sexist on a certain thing, if it is considered patriarchal, you just have to surrender to it, and you just have to compromise on it. The thing is that, you see, even the scientific naturalism is attacked by these, social justice warriors especially in the West, and by the advocates of political correctness. So on this issue, actually, scientific naturalists and philosophers, or even the theologians of some kind, they are on one page actually when it comes to deal with this kind of insane kind of political correctness. So uh, the other point is actually with that philosophy, as Matthew mentioned, uh, I think he was alluded to the to sociology of science in some sense, though not in exact words. But I think he was trying to talk about the sociology of scientific knowledge as well. That how social institutions and the social structures suitable for the scientific development have a role to play in the development of scientific knowledge, and that's those sociological structures, those kind of psychological kind of uh, kind of all these things cannot be kind of evaluated without without a sophisticated philosophical thinking.
Yeah. Just to add to that, yeah, to put a bit of meat on the bones, what I was thinking about specifically as an example was the case of eugenics. And between the 1920s, 30s, 40s, it was seen as highly respectable. And if you wanted to get research funding and be respected in the scientific community, you had to pay homage to eugenics as a legitimate branch of human science, as far as the application of Darwinian dynamics of evolution onto all of human society in the pursuit of purifying the genetic gene pool of humanity through sterilizations and other things based on statistical methods of analysis of your hereditary, background. That was only stopped when people realized the horrors of it in its practical application in full blown with Hitler and Nazi Germany. So I think that, we were practicing this in McGill in Canada and Harvard and Oxford, and this was like a common thing. So again, you're having a fascist or imperialist ethic governing your geopolitical system determined where the funding went. Why did the Rockefeller Foundation fund eugenics? Why did the British imperialist schools all fund eugenics as a branch of science? Because it was in conformity with their moral political philosophy that governed the larger macroeconomic structures. So I think that, yeah, and we're seeing in maybe with new names, a revival of a lot of these eugenics practices, but again, with different names in recent decades, which is, again, something that people should be talking a little bit more about and looking at with a more critical eye.
I want to get to Abdul Manan, and then I'm going to get to you, Matthew, on your last words. In your opinion, Abdul Manan, since you're a academically trained philosopher, do you think the question, does God exist, in the scientific realm, do you think that is philosophically correct?
No, actually, science does have a role to play in some context when it comes to dealing with these kind of metaphysical questions or the theological questions. But on its own, science has got nothing to do on these issues, nothing to say on these issues directly, actually. For example, if you take the example of a cosmological argument or the reconstructed form of the cosmological argument, that everything that begins to exist has a cause, universe begin to exist, therefore universe has a cause. In that deductive argument, if you see that minor premise that universe began to exist, actually this statement, which deals with the kind of, which is a kind of a logical form of an event, uh, it can be verified or denied with the help of science. But directly, the whole argument is not scientific. It's a formal argument. It's a logical argument. So science does have got something to say, which can be helpful in dealing with these kind of questions in a certain kind of a philosophical paradigm or philosophical framework. But directly, science has got absolutely nothing to say on it. For example, you take the example of the traditional questions of materialism and idealism. Uh, you say materialism is a term which is capable of innumerable meanings. There is no kind of framework in which materialism necessarily denies the existence of God. You can't bring any kind of statement that that can show that it necessarily denies the existence of God. And same is the case with idealism. And there is nothing in idealism, in the traditional idealism, that it necessarily kind of points towards God. So it's very difficult to say that any kind of scientific kind of judgment as a science on its own. Obviously it's very easy to say, in fact, that science can never say anything directly on these issues. You have to have a certain kind of a philosophical framework to kind of evaluate it. Science is certainly helpful, though, in dealing with these questions, but not directly.
Thank you so much for saying that. And you know, I want to put forward the question to Matthew. You heard Abdul Manan. He's there to uphold his philosophical opinion. He says that science does not directly address God because the framework of science doesn't go beyond metaphysical entities. I want to get to you some last words. Do you think that some scientists who claim that there is no God and they try to prove or disprove God through their scientific, expertise, do you think that's intellectually honest?
No, not really. I wouldn't. I I was just thinking about this the Bertrand Russell Copleston debate from 1948 on the BBC. It's a good debate, but it's really funny at the end where after talking for what is it, an hour or so, Copleston says, I suspect that we're having these problems because you don't seem to really believe in the necessity of existence. And Bertrand Russell's like, well, you're right. I see no obligation to adhere to the idea that that existence necessarily exists. And Copleston's it's like, well, why have we been debating this whole time? Like, I don't see a real point in continuing if you deny that that existence should be assumed. And Bertrand Russell's like, oh yeah, I agree perfectly. Let's drop this now. And you can see Bertrand Russell just doesn't care. He passes himself off as a great, scientific thinker with his Principia Mathematica, trying to like formalize the entire universe with Alfred North Whitehead in 1911. And he's, done these authoritative commentaries on Leibniz and on Riemann and tried to, package and interpret Einstein for people. But he doesn't really care about reality or the truth. He's really just in it because he's bored. He's like from a rich hierarchical 8th generation noble, from the British aristocracy. He doesn't care. He's just bored. And, he's beholden to certain political interests. Ultimately, you look at his life's work and every domain, even working with the CIA, with the Congress for Cultural Freedom in the 1940s, in promoting, postmodernism and modern art. Which is not detached from his scientific work. Or mathematical work. And I think that, again, when you look at science, you're looking for the laws, the invisible laws organizing the seeming chaos of matter, You look at the night sky with naive eyes, and it looks like random chaos of bright dots, and all sorts of mythologies can be cooked up to explain the holes in the big black carpet in the sky, with various mythologies you can create. But it's only when you have a more scrutinizing, informed eye that you start seeing that there's certain harmonic rhythms, patterns, and you could start hypothesizing, creating concepts that solve the mystery of these patterns, that then allow you to discover that some of these things are actually moving in an opposite direction. When you go out every night and you look at the same time at the night sky, there's certain dots that move in another direction. You say that, okay, these are planets, and you can start then formulating better ideas to perfect your idea of what these things are. So I think when you're dealing with laws, you're also dealing with a lawmaker. Like, why are these laws there rather than some other laws? And a lot of scientists, they try to cut that metaphysical implicit question short and just say we're just about describing the laws, and our job is not to think about what caused the laws. But I think it's implicit. As soon as you allow for that, you're thinking, you immediately implicitly open the door to the cause. Is there a harmonic unifying force organizing all of these separate laws in biophysics, chemistry, astrophysics, and morality? Is there a harmony, or are they all separate, disparate rules that you could just cook up and have no connection to each other? And that's a choice. That's a choice you have to make. And then you have to pursue it and test it out. Is your choice right or wrong to compartmentalize each of these branches? Or was it wrong? Is there actually unifying principles that we can discover? And are they being maybe suppressed? And if you start looking at the politics of science, one starts with this thought in mind, you will start finding, as I've encountered many people who have researched this line of thinking, as an active suppression of these unifying principles that tie various branches of the macrophysics, microphysics together with life science for a very long time. This is not a new thing. So you can't really avoid the politics of science no matter what you do. And you can't avoid the philosophy of science either. It's all sort of connected in a unified way with history, a study of real history. These are not different branches the way that they're taught in academia. And I think that that's a big reason why we lack a lot of creative energy to solve the big problems facing humanity right now, despite the fact that we're producing more graduates, university degrees than ever before in human history. You would think with all of these minds who are so educated, we would be having a lot more creative discoveries into big problems. And we're not. There's a big crisis. Why?
Last question, Abdul Manan. When you were talking that there were some scientists who needed a philosophy course, they needed to study philosophy properly. When you look at Richard Dawkins, and Matt knows this, he says in most of his lectures that the question why is a stupid question, and you guys should be asking how. I find this pretty rude, and I find his comment self-defeating. How do you reply to that? Do you think that there's any question that's a stupid question?
Actually, in my opinion, actually, Richard Dawkins is actually bringing a very bad name to the atheism. Let's be very honest. So all the atheists should be really, embarrassed of him and whatever he says. So he is basically a kind of a very third-rate kind of a polemicist. And I'm sorry to use a bit strong word, but he's just a polemicist, and he just uses all of his work is just an angry kind of diatribe against religion, very unsophisticated reasoning. And I think the kind of philosophy that he's not the one who totally denies philosophy. He takes pride in doing some kind of philosophy, and he's not one of those who actually clearly rejects philosophy and all that. But he knows actually not only very little philosophy, actually any kind, even an undergraduate student would get a failing grade if that student talks the way Richard Dawkins talks about philosophy. So I think most of his arguments are amongst the worst atheistic arguments in the history of Western thought. And atheism can be presented in a much better way actually than Richard Dawkins presents. So, I mean, even you have some kind of sympathy to atheism, Richard Dawkins is not the best kind of person to follow, and there is nothing much to deny about Richard Dawkins' thought actually, because there's nothing in his there is no kind of a proper theoretical framework. There is no kind of even philosophy of mind, no consistent framework of the philosophy of mind or philosophy of science or logical framework. There's nothing like that. So there's nothing to deny actually. There's nothing to deny. You can't deny Richard Dawkins because there is nothing in it. His
I
philosophical
mean,
work.
you can't. There's nothing to deny philosophically, or nothing to deny scientifically, or both.
Philosophically, obviously. So he might be a good scientist in his domain. I don't know about it, but philosophically or theologically, because whatever he says is just highly superficial. And so there is no kind of a proper theoretical framework.
Right.
So what would you deny? You have to have a proper framework to deny something. If there is no theoretical framework, if you don't offer any kind of proper theoretical framework, how can I deny your thoughts? How can I deny your philosophical approach? So I think that's not the best example to deal with. Richard Dawkins is just a polemicist or public speaker, I think. So
Can I say something on that?
Yeah, sure. Add something, and then we'll wrap up the show, Matt.
Okay. Yeah, I think the thing with Richard Dawkins specifically is that he is not able to, as many of these guys are, he's not able to himself live by or adhere to his own philosophical statements. So on the one hand, he doesn't believe in universal truths sometimes, and then other times he will go and impose in a very universal language his views onto all of science and all of philosophy. So, and I think, as you said, he's sort of a third-rate polemicist. He does model himself off of Thomas H. Huxley, who I think was a better polemicist, was more effective at being a nihilist than Dawkins is. And I think that has something maybe to do with the lack of sophistication in his audience. I'm not too sure in the society that we are living in, compared to the intellectual caliber of the people who Thomas Huxley had to persuade in the 19th century, who I think had a little bit more critical thinking and mental moral fortitude that he had to cut through. And you know, so that's probably a problem there as well, that there's a victimization of a lot of people who have been through a cultural stupidification process over decades that makes them more susceptible to finding bubblegum thinking like Dawkins presents and finding it persuasive. Especially when compared to the reality of things, when you just look at empirical data, it just showcases that there is all sorts of cases to be made scientifically for why he's wrong and why Darwinism is not the end-all explanation for life, including the lack of and we touched upon this in previous shows, but I mean, there's a lack of any missing links. There is obvious directionality in the flow of fossil records towards greater complexity, greater organization, greater development of the nervous system. And there's obvious cases that if this is happening, the question becomes, well, what is the nature of the space-time that we are existing in, such that life would, without the effect of human mind and human thought judging what is better or worse, have a directionality and a flow to it. It's just same thing for the harmonic orderings of the planets around the sun. Why would they be where they are and not some other place when they're currently in harmony, as Kepler proved, with the musical octave that we developed without even thinking about it? It was sort of an intuitive development of the well-tempering system. And it just so happens that we find the same proportions located in the planetary orbits. Is that a coincidence? Is that just luck? I mean, geez, like you're avoiding a lot of very rich, vistas of philosophical discussion that's very enriching and edifying. And you're just cutting all of that out and saying, don't even bother going there. Don't look at those vistas. There's nothing to see there. Just stay in your little cold, dark box. It's sad.
Wow.
Thank you so much, Matthew Ehret, for being on Zain Khan Live. It was a pleasure having you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Abdul Manan, joining us from Pakistan. It was a pleasure having you.
My pleasure, sir. My pleasure.
This was Matthew Ehret, a Canadian journalist and also a writer on topics of philosophy and social commentary. We were discussing the topic of, is philosophy dead? Is philosophy relevant? Joining us from Islamabad, Abdul Manan, a philosopher. He teaches philosophy in different colleges and universities. He's also the founder of a philosophical think tank called Saval Sangat. We were discussing the topics of scientism and philosophy. Until the next episode of Zain Khan Live, keep on watching Zain Khan Live. This is Zain Khan. Take care. Goodbye.